They offered love to strangers, but only those the world had forgotten. The Briarfield Inn promised comfort. It delivered something else. In 1862, 43 men walked into that house on the edge of Blackvale. None were ever seen again. The women who welcomed them wore soft hands and sad eyes. They fed them, warmed them, even listened to their broken stories. And then, they buried them, each one beneath the frostbitten soil behind the inn. One for every guest room. One for every lie. This is not folklore. This is not ghost story. This is a trail of blood that real men followed west and never returned from. And if you're watching this, you've already stepped too close to the truth. So don't turn back now. Like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who thinks they can handle what's coming. Because we are going all the way into the abyss. You need to stay with me until the very last second of this video, because the ending will change the way you see every kind face you've ever trusted. Blackvale was never on the map. Not officially. A mining town that never produced gold. A rail station where no train ever stopped. But for men in the 1800s, particularly those running from wives, debts, and the law, it was legend. They said there was a place up in the pine-covered hills of Appalachia where a man could disappear on purpose or by accident. That place was the Briarfield Inn. The records say it was founded in 1853 by a French Creole widow named Mother Clarice Belladoux and her 3 daughters, Isabel, Vivian, and Odette. Their claim was simple. They offered care to the weary, love to the lonely, and silence to the ashamed. But behind those candlelit rooms and warm bowls of stew, there was a method, a system, and a grave for every man who believed their smile. By 1862, the sisters had stopped hiding. They didn't need to. No one came looking. The war had ripped through every town between Pennsylvania and Louisiana. Soldiers went missing all the time. So did merchants, drifters, men no one would cry for. But one man did come back. And what he said before he died is what brings us here tonight. Because the Belladoux sisters didn't just kill for gold. They were building something far darker. The man's name was Eli Trenton. A former Union scout turned deserter, scar on his jaw, Bible in his coat. He stumbled out of Blackvale in January 1863, half-starved and raving. His hands were frostbitten. His eyes didn't focus. He had no memory of how long he'd been at Briarfield Inn. But he remembered the cellar. He remembered the sound of men beneath the floorboards. And he remembered Odette's voice in the dark, whispering a prayer that wasn't in any scripture he had ever heard. Eli died 4 days later in a field tent near Charleston. His final words were scribbled by a medic who didn't believe a word of it. They feed you love and boil your bones. The letter was never sent to his next of kin. It sat in a war file until 1907, sealed, ignored, and buried. But the land remembers. Locals still speak of the Belladoux sisters in frightened fragments. Always at night, never by name. They say Vivian could sing men to sleep from across the hallway. That Isabel had a voice like velvet and a heart like flint. And that Odette, sweet Odette, never blinked when she smiled. She was the one they sent to fetch the last thing the men clung to. Hope. The Briarfield Inn was not a business. It was a lure. A net strung wide through whispers and rumors, drawing in the kinds of men the world didn't miss. And once they entered that house, everything changed. Their past became weightless. Their names were lost. Even time behaved differently inside those walls. Because the Belladoux sisters weren't just clever. They were something older. The inn itself was built on cursed land, marked by early settlers in 1792 as unfit for habitation. Strange animal behavior, disturbed soil, and sudden illness plagued the area. Yet in 1853, Clarice Belladoux bought the deed in cash. No haggling, no hesitation. She said she had dreamt of the land since childhood, said it called to her. The truth is, she already knew what was buried there, and she knew how to wake it. What they did to those men was more than murder. It was ritual, a contract, and every grave behind the inn was a signature. By spring of 1864, whispers about Briarfield began reaching the ears of men who weren't so easily charmed. Men with clipboards. Men with cold eyes. One of them was Marcus Harlan, an inspector sent from the Office of Civilian Safety. a newly formed bureau tasked with monitoring inland towns during wartime shortages and disappearances. Harlan was methodical, a former preacher's son with a steel jaw and zero tolerance for superstition. He didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in facts. When Harlan arrived at the inn, he posed as a widowed clockmaker on his way to Georgia. Vivian greeted him. She smiled the way someone does when they've already read the last page of your story. He stayed 3 nights. On the 4th morning, he walked 20 miles barefoot, his boots missing, his hair torn out in clumps. He was found on the steps of a closed church in Ironvale, hands clasped in prayer, repeating the same sentence over and over again. Don't fall asleep on the 3rd night. That's when they take your name. He vanished from the hospital the next day. No one saw him leave. His clothes were found folded neatly beside his bed. In the pocket of his coat was a page torn from his journal. It read, "It's not the sisters that haunt the house. The house dreams through them." From that point forward, no official ever returned to Briarfield. But the visitors kept coming. War deserters, drifters, men who had wronged someone, men who needed to disappear. The kind of souls drawn to darkness like moths to an open flame. Then became a magnet, a sacred wound. Locals claim they'd see carriages arrive at dusk, never at day, and never with more than one man inside. Some were young, some were old. All of them entered willingly. None of them were ever seen again. But the strangest thing? No one ever heard screams. Only music. Soft, lilting piano from behind curtain windows. Sometimes a woman humming. Sometimes a hymn no church had ever taught. And every now and then, the unmistakable sound of voice. Male, desperate, afraid, repeating the same plea. Please, let me remember who I am. And just like that, the song would start again. Not all who vanished inside Briarfield were nameless. Some had stories. One of them was Callum Rourke, a war medic from Tennessee. He arrived in late autumn, 1864, his uniform still stained from the blood of men he couldn't save. Locals said he looked hollow, like a man already mourning something no priest could absolve. Callum checked in under his real name. That was his first mistake. Vivian, always behind the desk, always smiling, handed him a brass key without asking where he'd come from. She already knew. That's what disturbed people the most. The sisters never asked questions. They simply waited, as though the story had already unfolded in some other realm. He was placed in room 7. That room didn't face the hills like the others. It faced the rear garden, the place where the roses never bloomed. Callum stayed longer than most, 8 days. Each morning, he left his room with deeper shadows beneath his eyes. Each night, he returned just after dusk, clutching something under his coat. On the 5th night, a young chambermaid heard him speaking to someone in his room, though he was alone. On the 7th night, he went to the chapel in town, frantic, delirious. He claimed the sisters had shown him faces he'd never seen, but couldn't forget. Children crying behind cellar walls. A man buried up to his neck in lime. A girl's hand reaching from a hearthstone. He told the priest. They said I was supposed to help them. But I didn't. I just watched. The priest offered sanctuary. Callum declined. I need to finish the memory, he whispered. The next morning, the inn was silent. Room 7 was locked from the inside. When the door was finally opened, Callum was gone. But something else remained, a bed full of white feathers, as if a bird had been torn apart there. On the mirror, written backward in condensation, he remembered. Beneath the inn's porch that week, a single grave was dug. No name on the marker, just a crude carving of a scalpel and a weeping eye. No one ever booked room 7 again. But some nights, travelers swear they see a man in a blood-streaked uniform standing at the back of the inn, gazing into the garden, waiting to forget. Not all horror announces itself with screams. At Briarfield, it whispered through the walls. Visitors often reported hearing soft humming late at night. A lullaby, distant and aching, sung in a language no one could place. It wasn't French nor Latin. It was older, colder. And the strange part? The voices were always female, but never just one. One guest, a traveling preacher named Father Desmond Hale, wrote about the inn in his final journal. He claimed the Sisters Belladoux invited him to supper on his second evening. No one else was there, just the 3 women and him, seated in a candlelit room where no fire burned. They serve him a meal: lamb stew, wine, and a slice of black bread. But as he began to eat, he noticed something beneath the table: a fourth pair of legs, bare and bruised, crouched silently in the shadows beneath Sister Lucille's chair. They trembled, but no one acknowledged them. He left the inn that night, refusing to return. His entry closed with a final line, hastily scrawled in ink. They were skinned like saints, but they dine with the dead. 2 weeks later, Father Hale was found on the outskirts of Blackvale, barefoot, incoherent, muttering to himself in that same haunting language. He died shortly after. Autopsy revealed black soot lodged deep in his lungs, despite no evidence he'd been near any fire. It was the fourth case of black lung death tied to Briarfield. And then came Annabeth Lyle, a teenage orphan from Chattanooga. She never booked a room, never checked in. She simply wandered to the inn one night in the rain, her dress soaked, her voice shaking. She asked to speak with the sisters. No one knows what was said inside, but the next morning, the innkeeper found the front parlor lined with white candles. Each window was blacked out with thick cloth. In the center of the room stood Annabeth, her hands clasped tightly around a small iron crucifix, her head bowed. She spoke only once before disappearing entirely. They gave me a mother's touch, but it burned like salt. Another grave was dug. The marker bore no name, just the imprint of 2 small hands pressed deep into the stone, as if someone had clawed their way out. The Sisters Belladoux were always described the same way, too graceful to be of this world. Locals said their feet never made a sound on the floorboards. Their hands were soft, always warm, and their eyes hollow, not empty, but as if something ancient was staring out from behind them. But it was the way they remembered people that disturbed guests the most. They'd greet you by name before you ever introduce yourself. They'd speak about your childhood in alarming detail. One man, Nathaniel Greer, a Civil War deserter, fled the inn in the middle of the night, claiming that Sister Clarice had whispered his dead mother's lullaby into his ear while he slept. Not just the melody, the exact words. Even a nickname she gave him as a boy, Little Finch. There were no records of Nathaniel ever returning home. Instead, 3 weeks later, his brother reported receiving a package. No note, no return address. Inside it were 7 black feathers, a torn piece of military uniform, and a photograph of Nathaniel, smiling beside the sisters, dressed in black, standing in front of the inn's iron gate. His eyes were closed in the photo, but someone had drawn them back open with ink. And then came the twins from New Haven, Miriam and Elsie Calloway. They were quiet girls, just 16, traveling alone to meet a relative who never showed. They stayed at Briarfield for one night. Only one. The next morning, their luggage was still in the room, their bonnets left by the bed. But the girls were gone. When local lawmen searched the premises, they found the twins' names freshly carved into 2 apple trees at the back of the inn. Names only they themselves could have written. But stranger still, the branches above each name had begun to rot black. Just those 2. Nothing else in the orchard was touched. As if the trees knew, the lawmen left without pressing charges. In the months that followed, 32 crows were found dead on the inn's roof, their bodies twisted, wings bent backwards, beaks filled with dried ash. And not a single guest dared stay the night for the next 2 seasons. But the sisters waited. Doors unlocked. Tables set. They knew more were coming. When Reverend Silas Moore was invited to Blackvale by the county to look into things, he came armed with more than scripture. He brought a journal passed down from his predecessor, Father Edmund Wells, who had once traveled to that very region in 1831 during what was quietly referred to as the Winter of Shifting Eyes, a time when people vanished, not in crowds, but in patterns. First the loners, then the ones with secrets. According to the journal, Father Wells never stayed in Briarfield Inn, but he'd been to its grounds, long before it was an inn. Back then, it was just a ruin, a shell of a stone house no one claimed to own. Locals avoided it. Children dared each other to touch its rotted door. And inside that crumbling structure was an altar, but not a Christian one. It was carved from blackened sycamore, arranged in a spiral that had no beginning or end. Symbols were etched into the floor around it. Crooked eyes, stitched mouths, and a woman's silhouette with arms stretched outward, as if welcoming you into her chest. Wells left after 1 hour on the property. He said his mind hummed, and his thoughts no longer felt like his own. He never spoke of the place again. Reverend Silas Moore, armed with this knowledge, still entered Briarfield in the fall of 1862. His aim was to bless the inn, to rid it of whatever shadow clung to it. The sisters welcomed him. 3 days later, he was found kneeling at the foot of his bed, mouth sewn shut with horsehair, his own Bible clutched to his chest, pages missing, replaced with pressed roses and teeth. No forced entry, no signs of a struggle, just a note left by the bed, in handwriting no one could identify. The Reverend spoke love, but he did not believe in it. The inn stayed open. Guests kept coming. But after that night, every mirror inside Briarfield was covered with velvet cloths. Not by the sisters, by the guests. Something was staring back from them that was not their reflection. By the beginning of winter, 1862, the velvet cloths over the mirrors were no longer questioned. They became part of the experience. Like a silent agreement between the sisters and their guests. You do not look, and we will not show you. But the question that clawed at the minds of those who left Briarfield Inn was this. Why were the mirrors there in the first place? One woman, Eloise Maddox, a seamstress from Charleston, arrived at the inn just before Christmas. She had heard rumors, of course she had. But what mattered to her was peace, solitude, silence. The war had taken her husband. Disease had taken her children. She came not to rest, but to forget. The sisters welcomed her with warm wine and soft hands. They helped her undress, bathed her with rose water, and whispered words she couldn't quite understand, but which made her weep as if they understood every loss she'd ever buried. And then they led her to room 4, the only room that still had a mirror uncovered. Eloise later wrote in a letter never sent. I sat before the mirror, but I did not see myself. I saw someone I could have been. Someone untouched by death, unbent by grief. She smiled at me and held out her hand. And I almost took it. God help me, I almost took it. She left in the middle of the night, barefoot and shivering, refusing to speak. When her body was found weeks later in a dried-up well outside Blackvale, she had stitched her own lips shut and carved one sentence in her arms over and over again. It loved me too much. The town physician who examined her body claimed there were traces of wax around her eyes, as if someone or something had sealed them closed. Not to blind her, to keep something from getting out. And yet, despite all this, the inn remained open. And the sisters? They continued to serve tea, smile, and ask every guest the same question with a voice like lace. Are you ready to be seen? By January of 1863, the whispers reached the churches. And when whispers reach churches, they do not stay whispers for long. Father Anselm, a reclusive clergyman known for his silence and a haunted look in his eyes, was asked to visit Briarfield Inn. Not to condemn it, but to observe it. See what it truly is, the bishop had told him. And if it breathes of sin, we will cleanse it. He arrived on a cold Tuesday morning, dressed in his black robes, a cross dangling beneath his wool cloak. The sisters greeted him as they did all others, with grace, warmth, and a strange, seductive stillness that put every nerve on edge. They offered him no room, only a chair in the drawing room and a single cup of red tea. The priest said he had barely sipped it before the room began to shimmer, as if the very walls were sighing. He later wrote in a hidden letter, found only after his death. They spoke to me without moving their mouths. They showed me a cathedral not made of stone, but of flesh, beating, breathing, and eternal. I saw a throne carved of bone, and upon it, not a god, but a woman, smiling, weeping, singing. She was love incarnate, and she was hunger without end. That night, Father Anselm attempted to bless the inn. He sprinkled holy water across the archway. The air hissed, paint peeled, a chandelier crashed. He ran, not out of fear, but because, as he would later confess to a fellow priest, I felt it waking. I felt it inside me, stretching like something I carried all along. Days later, he renounced his cloth, burned his robes, and disappeared. Some say he wandered into the Blackvale marshes and was never seen again. But others believe he never left the inn at all. And if you stood outside Briarfield on certain cold nights in late winter, you could hear weeping, not from the sisters, from a man's voice, low, broken, and pleading, "Forgive me. I saw her. I'll let her in." What no one noticed, until it was far too late, was that the soil beneath Briarfield Inn was not ordinary soil. Beneath the flower beds and ivy, under the floorboards and root systems, lay something deeper. Not rock, not clay, but ash. Ash from rituals long forgotten, layered over with silence and charm, and fed, year after year, by the sisters' gifts. The original inn, according to records unearthed decades later, was built atop a collapsed chapel from the 17th century. The priest who once led it was burned alive, accused not of heresy, but of invoking the bride beneath the earth. Local legend, kept buried by polite society, spoke of a female entity worshipped in the swamplands long before the arrival of Christianity. She was said to dwell below the roots of birch trees, feeding off the broken, the weak, the grieving. The stories always ended the same way. She welcomes all, but none return. Now consider this. Every man who vanished after visiting the inn had entered willingly. Many of them had written letters before their journey. Letters that were later found tucked into their empty suitcases or mailed home weeks after their disappearance. Letters filled with phrases like, "I have never felt more at peace. I think I've finally found what I was looking for. She understands me. They understand me." Every line was soaked in delirious devotion. Not romantic, not religious, something else entirely. As if their minds were being rewritten, sculpted into obedience. One detective, sent from Blackvale's new constable office, spent 3 nights at the inn under a false name. He returned to his office on the 4th day. He filed no report. He never spoke of what happened. But he did sell all his possessions and moved into a small chapel near the woods, where he lived alone and silent until his death. And carved above his chapel door, chiseled with his own hands, were 3 words in Latin. Amor tollit mundi. Love devours worlds. The phrase, love devours worlds, wasn't found in any known religious scripture, but it began appearing quietly on gravestones, etched into bed frames, even whispered by some of the last men seen entering Briarfield Inn. What the town didn't yet realize was that something ancient and parasitic had taken root, and the Sisters Belladoux were no longer its caretakers. They were its vessels. There's a difference. In the winter of 1862, a firewood merchant named Elias Moreland made one final delivery to the inn. He was poor, desperate, and freshly widowed. His wife had died during childbirth 2 weeks prior. When he reached the front steps of Briarfield, he saw them waiting for him. Not just the sisters, but women who looked like them. 4 of them, then 8, then 12, all identical in posture, all swaying gently like reeds in moonlight. And not one of them blinked. Elias was never seen again. But 4 nights later, a boy walking with his father through the woods near the inn reported seeing a woman kneeling alone beside the creek, humming lullabies in a language he didn't know. Her skin was bone white, her hair black and soaked, as if she had just emerged from the soil itself. The father dismissed the boy's fear, until the boy found something tangled in the creek brush, a child's blanket, embroidered with the name Moreland. But Elias didn't have a child. He only had a stillborn, a name never registered, a burial never recorded, a grave never marked. And yet, the blanket was real. Locals began whispering. Was the inn not just swallowing men, but rebirthing something else in their place? Was the love they received not love at all, but a binding, a rewriting of self, a willing surrender to the sisterhood? And the deeper question remained, what was the source? Was it the chapel below the inn? Was it the earth itself? Or had the Belladoux sisters become mere echoes, puppets animated by something that didn't love them at all, but used the language of love to consume? And if so, how many had already been turned? On the morning of May 8th, 1862, something extraordinary happened. The bells of Blackvale Chapel began ringing, but there was no one inside. The doors were locked. the altar untouched, dust still coated every pew. Yet the bells rang in a slow, ceremonial rhythm, 7 long tolls followed by silence. And it didn't just happen once. It happened every morning, exactly at 3:33 a.m., for 43 nights straight. Some in the village believed it was a malfunction. Perhaps the old mechanism had become unstable. But the chapel had no such mechanism. The ropes were manual. Someone had to pull them. Someone was inside, or something was reaching out. By the 12th night, fear swallowed Blackvale whole. Children were kept indoors. Horses refused to go near the inn's road, and the mayor issued a temporary travel ban. Anyone attempting to reach the Briarfield Inn would be arrested. But despite the ban, people were still disappearing. Men from neighboring towns, a pair of traveling priests, even 2 Union soldiers on leave. Their horses found wandering, reins snapped, and in one case, blood still wet on the saddle. The Sisters Belladoux were never questioned, because no one could get near them. By then, the inn had changed. Locals began reporting that the building's structure itself was shifting. Windows that were once there now vanished. New corridors where none had been before, and an unnatural mist that always rolled in after midnight, hovering only around the inn's roof like a halo of rot. And within that mist, villagers swore they saw them. Silhouettes of women, arms open, lips smiling, standing still at the edge of visibility, calling, waiting, offering what they always had, love, but love wrapped in submission, in surrender, in soft, quiet death. The kind of love that doesn't end, because it doesn't let go. This was no longer just a haunted inn. It was a machine, harvesting desire and guilt, turning loneliness into fuel. And the more people vanished, the louder the bells rang. 7 tolls, 43 nights. And not once did anyone ask, why that number? The number 43 became a curse whispered through Blackvale's broken sleep. 43 bells, 43 nights. And when the ground was finally dug, 43 graves. But here's the detail that shook even the most hardened constables. Every grave was perfectly aligned in the Briarfield garden. Each one precisely 5 feet deep, spaced 33 inches apart, in the shape of a crescent, mirroring the constellation Cassiopeia. None of these graves bore names. Just symbols, engraved in white ash and pressed into smooth stone. The same sigils that would later be found in occult manuals written nearly 40 years after the sisters' disappearance. Manuals that described rituals of astral communion, binding affection, and emotive harvesting. It was as if Briarfield had been ahead of its time, or worse, outside of time altogether. But the corpses? That was the real terror. Not one showed signs of violence. No bruising, no poison, no puncture wounds. They were simply empty, as if the soul had been kissed out of them. Every expression was frozen in longing, arms reaching upward, like they had died mid-embrace with something no one else could see. And the investigators? Most of them never filed their reports. 3 resigned from law enforcement entirely. 1 was committed, and the youngest, Elias Kempt, who had never missed a day of work, vanished 1 week after visiting the graves. His last journal entry read only, "The women are not women, and the love is not love." We are now halfway through this tale of buried hunger and spiritual decay. And if you followed us this far, type this phrase in the comments below, not once but twice. I saw the sisters in the fog. Do it now. It will let us know who's still with us, and who's already under their spell. That IT was the townspeople of Blackvale who demanded answers, answers they would never truly receive. The local clergy called it witchcraft. The press labeled it a cult of seduction. And the scientists, those who dared come, retreated in silence. But behind the veil of confusion, an old woman named Maeve Calder came forward. She was the last known guest who had ever left Briarfield Inn alive. Her testimony was not taken seriously at the time, dismissed as the ramblings of a traumatized elder. But today, it reads like a transcript of spiritual invasion. Maeve claimed that upon arriving at the inn in 1859, she was greeted not with keys, but with questions. They asked her, "What do you ache for? Whom have you lost? If love could return, what would you give for it?" She thought it was an eccentric welcome, until the third night. Maeve awoke in a room lit by no candles, only a pale, humming light that seemed to rise from the floorboards themselves. At the foot of her bed stood 3 women, all dressed in violet silk, hands clasped, chanting in a tongue older than Latin. And behind them, a 4th figure, face shrouded in lace, floating an inch above the ground. Maeve didn't remember how she escaped, only that when she did, she was found wandering the woodlands 10 miles outside Blackvale, barefoot and bloodied, repeating the same phrase over and over. They gave me what I wanted, but it wasn't love. She died the following spring. Her body was buried with salt lining her coffin, and her last wish, scrawled on the back of a hymn book, "Do not let them sing me to sleep." To this day, no one can explain how she survived or why she was spared. But some whisper that the sisters let one go, each generation. A witness, a warning, a seed. You're starting to feel it now, aren't you? The truth pressing against the inside of your skull. But it's not done yet. The next chapter reveals what lay beneath the foundation of the inn and the letters that were never meant to be found. When renovations were proposed in 1863, no one truly expected what they would find. The new owner, a businessman from Philadelphia named Warren Trask, purchased the Briarfield Inn at a heavy discount. He was told the property was abandoned due to local superstition and unfortunate deaths. Trask thought it was all nonsense, rural folklore with no bearing on modern business. His plan was to restore the building and turn it into a retreat for the wealthy. But when workers began removing the rotted floorboards in the east wing, their hammers struck something unusual. It wasn't stone. It wasn't wood. It was iron, a circular hatch sealed with symbols no one could read. It took 3 men to pry it open. Below was a narrow, spiraling staircase that led to a hidden cellar. Not on any blueprint, not in any deed. At the bottom, lit only by their lanterns, was a room lined with small doors, 43 of them, each no taller than child, each bearing a name etched into brass. Eloise, Margaret, Thomas, Judith, Clara, the same names listed on the tombstones in the back orchard. And on the far wall of the cellar, written in deep red paint, perhaps blood, were 5 words. They begged us to stay. One of the workers, Elias Moore, reportedly fainted on the spot. Another, James Callahan, refused to return to the property. But Trask? He pushed forward, and it was Trask who opened one of the small doors, thinking it merely a storage compartment. Inside, he found parchment letters, wrapped in cloth and sealed with violet wax. They were written in a hand so refined, it looked printed. Each letter began the same way. To the one who came alone. They read like prayers, but not to God, to her. To the one the sisters called the eternal embrace, a being they claimed arrived before men had tongues, and who feeds not on flesh, but on grief made willing. And this is the moment you realize this wasn't a boarding house. It was a temple, midway through our tale now. If you're still watching, comment this phrase twice. They begged us to stay. It's how we know you've seen too much. The town wanted silence. When Warren Trask delivered the letters to the Blackvale mayor's office, he was met with immediate resistance. Not concern, not shock, resistance. The mayor at the time, Leonard Grieve, locked the documents in a steel drawer and told Trask to forget he ever found them. No public statement, no investigation. The official reason for halting renovations was structural instability. But Trask couldn't let it go. The letters had done something to him. He began to dream, vivid, relentless dreams. He saw the sisters in their nightgowns, pale and smiling, whispering from the walls. He saw children, holding candles, forming circles in dark rooms, and singing hymns in a language he didn't know. But worst of all, he dreamed of her, of the eternal embrace. In the dream, she appeared faceless, wearing a long veil and gloves. Her arms were always open, always waiting, and every time, just before waking, she would whisper, "If they suffer, they stay." Trask's obsession spiraled. He returned to the inn alone, night after night, descending into the sealed cellar with nothing but his lantern. Locals reported seeing flickering lights in the windows at odd hours. Some claimed they heard music, violin or cello, slow and dissonant, coming from underground. Weeks later, Trask's personal journal was found in the ashes of his estate. It contained only one entry. The cellar breathes when I speak her name. I think I finally understand what love is. After that, Trask was never seen again. His carriage was found overturned in the woods with both horses dead. No body, no blood, no footprints. Just one thing carved into the trunk of the nearest tree. Love never leaves. The Briarfield Inn was sold once more, but no buyer ever stepped inside. Not even the Sisters Belladoux had left anything so seductive and cursed. And so the building stood untouched, like a mausoleum preserved for someone or something that still required it. And now you know, every secret kept by a small town, every don't go there warning whispered by the old, comes from somewhere. This was Blackvale's origin of silence. And the silence was never empty. The silence was only the surface. Beneath Blackvale's forced normalcy lay a growing awareness, an infection of unease that spread like rot through the town's roots. People stopped using the main road near the inn. Children weren't allowed to play past dusk. Even priests changed the way they looked at the building during sermons, avoiding the topic of hospitality altogether, as if they feared summoning it. Then came the whispers. They started with a few old women in the market square. I saw a candle burning in the attic window last night, one said. Another claimed she'd seen figures moving along the porch at 3 a.m., though the inn had been sealed for over a year. But most disturbing were the sightings of a woman in white, standing barefoot on the front steps, holding nothing but a small vial in one hand. They called her the waiting sister. No one ever saw her face. Every time someone tried to approach, she vanished, not into the inn, but into the earth, as if she sank into the soil. By 1864, the town council attempted to legally demolish Briarfield, but permits went missing. Contractors who showed up were stricken with sudden illness. One man fell from a scaffold and shattered every bone in his body, but didn't bleed. He lived long enough to whisper something strange. She said, "Love is pain." And I loved her. You see, whatever the Sisters Belladoux had left behind wasn't just spiritual, it was architectural. The very structure of the inn had become a temple of longing, a parasite that pulled emotion from the living and shaped itself into something sentient. A historian from Charleston named Gregory Vale attempted to document the phenomenon in 1865. He stayed at a nearby rectory and took sketches from afar. His final entry? She watches me now. Even when I close my eyes, she's nearer. And I'm beginning to think that the others didn't die, they stayed. He was found drowned in his own bathtub. The water wasn't water. It was rose-colored oil, scented with cloves and something like lavender. They never opened that bottle. But if you listen closely, sometimes you can hear the cork creak open when you pass the inn. By the spring of 1866, the legends had begun to mutate. Now, it wasn't just about the sisters or even the graves. A new tale had gripped Blackvale, a story whispered between farmers, merchants, and drunkards at the tavern. The inn feeds. No longer passive, the Briarfield Inn was described as active, almost hunting. Travelers, those who hadn't heard the local warnings, reported strange dreams after walking past it. A woman knocking on their window at night. The smell of perfume following them home. And always a voice whispering 3 words. You are lonely. When these travelers returned home, some went mad. Others vanished entirely. In one case, a mailman named Henry Dalton from Glenmore made his last stop in Blackvale. The next day, his wife reported him missing. All that was found was his mailbag, dropped in front of the Briarfield gates. Inside was a single unposted letter addressed to his wife. It read, "I know now what I've been missing, and I've never felt more wanted." The handwriting was not his. Desperation grew. The town demanded intervention from the church, and a bishop from Baltimore, Edwin Harrow, arrived with a group of 5 clerics to perform a cleansing ritual. Armed with crucifixes, salt, incense, and iron stakes, they entered Briarfield Inn on the morning of October 13th. Only one came out. Not running, not screaming, just walking, slowly, smiling. When he was asked what had happened inside, he said nothing. He simply reached into his pocket and handed the mayor a note. It read, "Let them love. They're not done." That priest was never identified again. Within 2 weeks, he vanished. The inn was sealed again. Boards nailed shut. Iron spikes driven into the ground. Prayer circles were held for 9 nights straight. But even then, the earth would not hold. Because at the base of the property, on a still night in winter, a traveler reported hearing something move beneath the ground. A breathing, slow and deliberate. And with it came a scent in the air, rose oil and blood. By early 1867, the church, the town of Blackvale, and even the state were in silent agreement. No one would speak of the Briarfield Inn again. It was as if a pact had been made, an unspoken vow to leave it buried, untouched. Children were forbidden to go near the hillside. Mapmakers were instructed to erase the location from county records. The road that led to the inn, once called Belladoux's Way, was renamed simply Route 9, and locals avoided even uttering that name after dark. But nature has a cruel memory, and the wind in Blackvale does not forget. Travelers continued to report hearing voices when they passed through. Not screams, not wails, songs. Soft, melodic lullabies in a tongue no one could translate. Women's voices, harmonizing, floating just beneath the trees. One surveyor, Henry Caldwell, took it upon himself to investigate. He was a pragmatic man, known for his skepticism of superstition. In his journal, later recovered in tatters by a search party, he documented his approach to the inn. "The soil here feels warm," he wrote. "Unseasonably so. And I swear I can smell gardenias, though it's mid-January." He entered the gates. He did not return. What they did find was strange beyond measure. 43 white gloves nailed to the inn's front door, each carefully stitched with the initials B or S. Belladoux. Sisters. Even more unsettling, when one of the gloves was removed, blood poured from the nail hole in the door, as though the house itself was wounded. Soon after, the woods around the inn changed. Animals avoided the area. Trees refused to grow leaves. The birds, once abundant, flew away from Blackvale altogether. And near the inn's boundary, buried in the snow, a grave was discovered, the 44th. Unmarked, fresh, still warm. Inside, no bones, no body, just a single, crumpled note in red ink. "We love who you forget." This was no haunting. This was not vengeance. This was devotion twisted into something unspeakable. And the sisters? They had never truly left. They had merely become something else. Something the church feared, but could never destroy. Something eternal. The church, for all its sanctity and power, knew it had lost control of the narrative. Not just of the Sisters Belladoux, but of the territory itself. The ground around the inn no longer belonged to man or God. Something older had claimed it. By spring of 1868, whispers began to circulate through underground circles. Whispers not of ghost stories, but of pilgrimages. People from distant towns, even other states, were seen walking alone toward Blackvale. Always at dusk. Always in silence. Many of them were women. Many of them were visibly bruised, limping, or wearing mourning black. And all of them vanished near the old Route 9A turnoff. The church sent men to investigate. Not priests, not missionaries, inquisitors, men trained to identify, root out, and extinguish heresy. They arrived in Blackvale under cover of night, equipped with torches, sacred relics, and strict orders. Burn the inn to the ground. Salt the soil. Speak no prayers. But what happened next was not in any scripture. On the night of their raid, witnesses say the trees themselves moved, bent, folded inward, as if shielding something. The wind howled with the sound of thousands of women humming in unison. No lyrics, just one harmonic, rising tone that seemed to press against the skull like a fever dream. By morning, every inquisitor was dead. No blood, no wounds, just open eyes, open mouths, and hands clasped together tightly, as if in reverence. Their torches untouched, their relics buried in dirt beside them. And the inn? Untouched. Not a single burn mark. No signs of struggle. Inside, the walls were lined with fresh garlands, flowers not native to North America. The air smelled of warm skin and perfume. On the parlor table sat a silver tray of tea, still steaming. And on the mirror above the mantel was a single phrase, written in what experts would later say was lip rouge. We gave them peace. Not justice. Not wrath. Not cruelty. Peace. But at what price? This was no longer just about 43 graves. This was about a new kind of worship, one the church could neither name nor fight. And it was spreading. The deaths of the inquisitors were officially ruled unexplained. But no one believed that. Not in Blackvale. Not in the church. Not in Washington. There was a quiet consensus that something ancient had been awakened in that forest, and it could not be challenged with fire or prayer. And yet, pilgrims kept coming. The women came first, widows, former asylum patients, victims of unspeakable abuse. But then came men, powerful men, politicians, bankers, military officers. Disguised in plain clothes, they traveled by night, careful never to speak of their destination aloud. Each one entered the Briarfield Inn. Each one was never seen again. But that wasn't the terrifying part. The terrifying part was what they left behind. In journals, letters, diaries hidden in walls, cryptic testimony discovered decades later, often buried in the archives of private families. Every written account was eerily similar, even across different states and timelines. They all said the same thing. I heard her voice before I opened the door. Not a voice. Not someone's voice. Her voice. Always singular. Always familiar. Always loving. Some described it as the voice of a mother. Others, a lost lover. One man wrote it was the voice of his daughter who had drowned in 1854, and that when he heard her calling from inside the inn, he knew she forgave him. Forgiveness. That's what the Belladoux offered. Not just comfort, not companionship, but ultimate, crushing, unbearable forgiveness. The kind that collapses your identity, makes you fall to your knees, and weep like a child who finally feels safe. That was their power, and the church had no weapon against it. In fact, some began to suspect, though they dared not speak it aloud, that the church itself had been infiltrated, that certain bishops, cardinals, and even abbots had visited Blackvale in secret, returned hollow-eyed and changed. Less vengeful, more silent, less wrathful, more obedient, and beneath their cassocks, some wore a red flower pinned to their chest, a flower known to bloom only once, in soil soaked with blood, salt, and sorrow. A flower no botanist could identify. In 1865, a man named Elias Henwick arrived in Blackvale, claiming to be a surveyor for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. His papers were immaculate, his story believable, but locals weren't fooled. They watched him carefully. He didn't ask about terrain or coal lines. He asked about the inn, about the women who once lived there, and most disturbingly, about the voices. He rented a room at the edge of the forest and stayed for 7 nights. On the 8th, he disappeared, but unlike others, Elias returned. They found him wandering the Blackvale fields in broad daylight, barefoot, face gaunt, suit torn, lips moving in silent prayer. His journal was found tucked inside his vest. Not hidden, not coded, open, as if he wanted the world to read it. The final entry was dated the morning of his disappearance. It said, "She knew my name before I even said it. She asked me why I hated myself, and I told her everything. I told her what I did at sea, what I did to Clara, why I left in that fire. I told her about the girl in New York, about the ledger in Baltimore. I told her the things not even God had seen. And still, she forgave me. I wept like a drunk child, and she smiled. And then she took my hand and led me into a room that did not exist in this world. I never want to leave it. I never want to remember what I was before her voice found me." The doctors who examined Elias said his mind had fractured from prolonged isolation. But no one believed that, especially not the mayor, who swore that Elias had been seen speaking to a woman in black lace just hours before his vanishing. A woman whose feet never quite touched the ground. And when they searched the ruins of the inn again, though it had been ashes for over a decade, something new had appeared. A wooden door, untouched by fire, carved with names. 43 of them. Each name matched a known death or disappearance from the last 30 years. Each one carved not with anger or vengeance, but with reverence. like a hymn. The last name was freshly cut. Elias Henwick. The door was taken to the Blackvale Parish Hall for examination. Parishioners feared it, but they couldn't look away. For 3 nights, it sat upright against the eastern wall, silent, heavy, strange. But on the 4th morning, something changed. The custodian, Harold Lim, arrived early to find the entire room soaked in condensation, as if the hall had wept through the night. The door, once dry and dark, was now warm to the touch. And the names, they were bleeding. Not red, not human. A thick, amber sap oozed from each carved letter. A priest tried to wash it away. The wood hissed, the floorboards shook, and every candle in the room extinguished at once. After that, the door was locked in the cellar. But the dreams began almost immediately. 10 members of the parish, men and women alike, reported the same vision. A corridor of white lace, a hand reaching out, a voice, soft as breath, whispering, "I offered you mercy, and you spat in its face." The priest tried burning it. Nothing happened. They took an axe to it. Steel bent. Finally, they shipped it off to Ravenshade for storage, but the carriage broke down just a mile outside Blackvale. Horses refused to move. The door was returned, and no attempt was made again. That night, someone scrawled on the church wall in chalk, "Let the sisters sleep." And below it, another line, smaller as if added by a different hand. "They wake when the world forgets what they were." Those who remembered the Sisters Belladoux say they were not vengeful, not evil, but they were powerful. They carried the pain of every man they touched and refused to give it back. It was a choice, a burden, a final gift, one the world had no name for. And as the decades passed, each attempt to destroy or discredit their story only made it stronger. Each witness who denied them became a character in their myth. And those who believed, they came to Briarfield Inn in the dead of night and listened. Some came back changed. Others never returned. And always, the whisper remained. By 1894, the whispers had grown into something louder. Travelers began reporting distant voices from the woods surrounding Briarfield Inn. Not screams, not howls, but the clear, unmistakable sound of women singing. A lullaby, wordless, echoing. Locals started calling it the morning song. One railway worker, Leonard Greaves, heard it while repairing a track near the Blackvale bend. He followed the sound into the trees, swearing he saw a woman in a long white gown walking backward, slowly, deliberately, into a copse of dead willows. He returned an hour later with his face scratched, his eyes bloodshot, and a single word on his tongue. Love. He couldn't explain it. Not the voice. Not the forest. Not the way his body trembled when he remembered her hands, cold as river stones, touching his face. Within weeks, stories like Leonard's flooded into town. And each time, the details were nearly identical. A woman in white. A mournful melody. A question whispered in the dark. Do you want to be known? Not loved. Not saved. Not forgiven. Known. And those who answered yes, they came back with secrets. Not just visions or feelings, but facts they had no way of knowing. One man described the last breath of a sailor who died off the coast of Norway. Another, a widow from Ravenshade, recounted the final thoughts of her dead husband, thoughts he'd never spoken aloud. And yet, no one could prove how they knew. The phenomenon came to be called Belladoux's sight. Clergy denounced it. Scientists mocked it, but none dared approach the inn. By then, the graves had begun to shift. Several locals noticed that each spring, the soil over the 43 graves would crack open, just slightly, like breath escaping from the earth itself. No bodies were ever seen. No bones rose. But one woman, Clara Penwright, claimed she saw something else. A gloved hand reaching out. It didn't grasp. It didn't flail. It simply pointed toward the town, as if to remind them that forgetting came with consequences. The sisters had offered love, but not for free, and the debt was still collecting. In the year 1896, a well-known spiritualist by the name of Marguerite Sallow arrived in Blackvale, determined to free the town from its burden. She had read about the Belladoux sisters and the graves at Briarfield Inn in old theological journals, in occult bulletins, and in a handful of banned books that whispered of empaths who fed on memory, not blood. She came dressed in black, bearing no luggage, only a silver satchel filled with salt, thread, and glass beads. Protection relics, she called them. Marguerite did not ask for the mayor's blessing. She did not speak to clergy. She went straight to the inn at dusk, walked the broken steps, and stood at the mouth of the graveyard behind the inn. Locals watched from a distance, many hiding behind trees or carriages. No one stopped her. She laid out the beads in a perfect circle and began to chant in an old tongue few could recognize. The air shifted. Cold swept across the fields. And then, the singing began again. But this time it didn't come from trees. It rose from the earth itself. Low, harmonic, like a choir beneath the soil. Witnesses say Marguerite paused, then fell to her knees. One hand clutched her chest. The other gripped her satchel so tightly her knuckles bled. And then the voices spoke through her. Not her voice. Not in English. Dozens of tongues. Dozens of tones. All tumbling from her throat like water spilling from a broken jar. When it stopped, she turned to the watchers and said only this. They never stopped loving you, but you stopped deserving it. She collapsed. By morning, Marguerite was gone. Her satchel remained on the ground, untouched, undisturbed, and humming. Inside were not the beads, not the salt, not the thread, but hair, locks of it, dozens of shades and textures, braided, curled, combed straight, some still warm, and a note, written in black ink. If you do not remember what they gave, you will remember what they took. That winter, the singing never stopped. It echoed under floorboards, beneath beds, behind walls, and the townspeople began to murmur the question in their sleep. Do you want to be known? By spring of 1897, Blackvale had changed. Children no longer laughed in the streets. Churches stood half empty. Windows remained shuttered, even in daylight. A thick fog would gather every evening around the Briarfield Inn, and no wind, natural or conjured, could push it away. What began as whispers turned into chants. People spoke of dreams they couldn't wake from. Visitors passing through reported seeing pale women in vintage gowns walking hand in hand across the fields just before sunrise, smiling, always smiling, as if watching someone they once knew suffer in silence. The mayor's wife, Helena Caulfield, disappeared that May. Her shoes were found placed neatly at the inn's threshold, with a pressed flower between them, a yellow carnation, the Victorian symbol of rejection. Inside the shoes, stuffed in the toe of the left one, was a sliver of paper bearing the same phrase. They waited for you. You never came. The townsfolk demanded the church step in, but the clergy were already compromised. Father Belgrave, the aging priest who once warned the town never to approach the inn, was found muttering to himself at the edge of the graveyard, covered in dirt. His fingers were raw, nails cracked, soil packed under each nail bed. He had been trying to dig, but not to bury, not to exhume, to reach. When they carried him off, he whispered through broken teeth, "They're not under the earth. They're under us." After that, no one came close to the inn. And yet, the number of graves rose. By fall, it wasn't 43. It was 49, all marked with fresh stones. No one had reported deaths. No funerals were held. No one in town had gone missing. And yet the ground shifted. One man who dared approach the site claimed to have seen something written behind the inn's rotting shingles, scratched with fingernails into the wood. A single word: regret. He never returned home. The graves, it seemed, were not for those who had died. They were for those who had forgotten. The townspeople of Blackvale began whispering a phrase behind closed doors. The sisters still walk. It wasn't a superstition anymore. It was a fear passed down, inherited like illness or guilt. By the early 1900s, several families began sealing their homes with wax at night, marking their doors with salt and iron nails. Not for burglars, for something older, something invited. Because that's the horror no one wanted to admit out loud. They had invited it in. The Sisters Belladoux didn't return as wrathful spirits clawing through walls. No, they came gently, with voices soft and maternal, with the scent of lavender and blood in their wake. They came as a memory, a comfort, a promise. One by one, Men of great influence in Blackvale fell into isolation, judges, landowners, bankers, all claiming to be visited by familiar hands, caressed by unseen lips. Some wept, some laughed in private, but all of them spoke of one thing before they died. She forgave me. I never deserved it. Their bodies were always found seated, peaceful, but the cause of death was never natural. Their hearts were removed, precisely, as if by a skilled surgeon, and each time, the same phrase carved delicately into their skin. Do not offer what you cannot love. The townspeople pleaded for help from the outside. Investigators, spiritualists, journalists. But none stayed long. Every outsider reported dreams of being surrounded by warm hands, beckoned toward the woods. One man, a renowned psychologist from Boston, left behind only a journal before vanishing. The final entry read, "They're not ghosts. They are wounds that were never allowed to heal." Locals began referring to the graves not as resting places, but as seals, holding back the full return of the Belladoux presence. Not everyone believed it, but those who did lived longer. One chilling discovery came in 1907 when a new school was built near the outskirts of Briarfield. While digging, workers uncovered a buried wall, stone, ornate, and carved into its arch. "We offered love. You answered with fear." Under that inscription, the symbol of the three sisters joined at the hands. A reminder that they had never left, only waited, and Blackvale was still theirs. By the time the 1920s arrived, Briarfield Inn had become little more than a hushed ghost story, a local curse teenagers dared each other to confront. But one woman didn't see it that way. Eliza Carrington, a wealthy heiress and spiritualist, purchased the property with one goal in mind: to reopen it. She claimed to have been visited by the sisters since childhood, calling them the last true mothers of this world. In interviews, she spoke calmly, poetically, even seductively about what others called madness. They only punished because they were betrayed. Their love was never false. She restored the inn to its former beauty. Lace curtains, oil lamps, velvet lounges, and portraits of the three sisters hung in the great hall. Local clergy protested. Newspapers called her insane, but still she opened the doors. Guests came, some curious, some desperate for healing, all left with the same story: peace, a sense of being held, cradled, spoken to in their dreams. Some even said their illnesses improved. One man claimed his blindness lessened. And then, 2 months after reopening, Eliza vanished. No break-in, no sign of struggle. She simply disappeared from her locked room. The only trace, a letter placed carefully on her pillow. It read, "They welcome me. I have chosen to stay." Once again, the enclosed. And this time, no one dared enter. The townspeople placed iron rods across the gates and declared it condemned. But strange occurrences continued. Visitors who stood at the gates reported hearing lullabies, women's voices humming. One couple even claimed to see candlelight in the top window. No one could explain it. Children born in Blackvale in the years following often described dreams they shouldn't have known about. 3 women in black dresses holding hands, calling their names. Some said it was just trauma passed down. Others knew better. The Sisters Belladoux had become more than legend. They were now woven into the identity of the town itself. Their story wasn't about vengeance or horror anymore. It was about the terrifying depth of love that had once been offered and betrayed. And Blackvale would never be free from what it buried alive, because it hadn't buried bodies. It had buried a sacred covenant, one that still breathes beneath the floorboards of Briarfield Inn. In 1963, a university research team from Boston arrived in Blackvale. Their mission was simple on paper: investigate rural folklore and its influence on collective memory. But behind closed doors, the team admitted they had been drawn by something more. They had all dreamed the same dream, weeks before even selecting their destination. In the dream, 3 women stood at the end of a candlelit corridor, whispering, "Tell them." It was never murder. The team included psychologists, historians, and even a defrocked priest who'd once been obsessed with mystical theology. They stayed at a farmhouse nearby and set up base at the town hall, poring over court records, medical files, and church archives. What they found horrified them. 43 names. 43 visitors to Briarfield Inn confirmed dead, but not from violence, not from poison or madness. Each was marked natural causes: heart failure, stroke, fainting, or unknown systemic shutdown. It was as if something inside them simply let go. One researcher, Dr. Elias Monroe, became obsessed. He began visiting the inn at night, sometimes staying at the locked gate for hours. One morning, the team found a note in his handwriting. They're not gone. They wait. And they forgive. The priest on the team broke down during a recorded interview, saying, "They're not spirits. They're sacred vessels. They offered the kind of mercy that undoes men, and we crucified them for it." The project was shut down by the university. All findings sealed, but not before one final act. The team placed a small stone marker outside the inn's rusted gate. No name, no date, only 3 carved letters. SBV, Sisters Belladoux Vigil. Locals report that every year, on the exact day the inn was raided in 1862, fresh roses appear beneath that stone. No one ever sees who places them. And even now, the scent of lavender sometimes drifts through the town square without warning, as if the past is exhaling, or warning. Because when love is desecrated and divinity profaned, it doesn't fade. It transforms. B. Why 1979, whispers had returned to Blackvale. But this time, they didn't come from the inn. They came from the children. For boys playing hide-and-seek near the ruins of Briarfield and claimed to hear singing from beneath the earth. Not screams, not sobs. Singing. Soft. Feminine. Foreign. Their parents dismissed it as childish imagination, but a week later, one of the boys vanished. His shoes were found placed neatly at the inn's gate. Not a footprint beyond that. Not a trail. He had simply vanished. 2 days later, his voice was heard on a neighbor's baby monitor, repeating the same line. They were kind. I want to stay. It was dismissed as frequency interference. But that same voice was recorded again, this time by a paranormal research team from Richmond. They captured a 12-second clip of whispers inside the ruins. Experts confirmed the voices overlapped in impossible ways. Multiple speakers, but one consciousness. As if a choir of women were speaking through one mouth. The team never returned. Their notes ended with a single handwritten page. On it, a sentence written over and over again. They offered love. We offered fire. That same year, the land was bought by a private individual from Vienna who refused to reveal his identity. He fenced off the area, posted guards, and installed infrared cameras. But what happened next was worse. People began dreaming again. Not of ghosts, but of truths buried in silence. They'd wake up weeping, unable to describe what they saw. Only one man could speak of it, a gravekeeper who lived down the road. He said, "It's not the inn that's haunted. It's us. We did something wrong. We turned mercy into witchcraft, beauty into evil. And now we live with what we killed." Authorities never acted. Locals stopped asking questions. And over time, the whispers became part of the wind. Familiar, almost comforting. But some say, if you kneel before the inn on the night of December 3rd, the date of the raid, and listen carefully, you'll hear a voice say, "We forgive you, but we will not let you forget." There's a strange kind of silence that settles over Briarfield Inn now. Not the peaceful silence of rest, but the charged quiet that comes just before a storm. The kind of silence where every tree holds its breath and every shadow seems to wait. In 1983, an investigative journalist named Helen Whitlock arrived in Blackvale. She had been tipped off by an anonymous letter that read simply, "The women never left. They were buried awake." She was skeptical, methodical, unmoved by ghost stories. But what she uncovered was worse than superstition. It was systematic erasure. She found court records with missing pages, medical documents signed by non-existent physicians, and death certificates forged by a sheriff's deputy who died in 1874. Someone, for over a century, had gone to great lengths to rewrite history. And yet, in the attic of Blackvale's abandoned town hall, Helen found a box. Inside, 43 portraits, all of women, all with black veils. Each photograph had a name scrawled on the back, but the handwriting was unfamiliar, elegant, flowing, not from the local records. These weren't criminal mugshots. They were memorials. She published her findings. The article was never printed. Her editor vanished the week before its release. Helen herself went missing 2 months later. Her apartment was left untouched. Her notes gone. But on her typewriter, one final sentence was left behind. They only asked to be remembered. We chose to forget. And still, the town remains silent. No one speaks of the inn. Tourists pass by without knowing. Children grow up with stories they're told never to repeat. And the land breathes under the weight of secrets too heavy to exhume. But the graves are still there. 43 uneven mounds in a private grove behind rusted gates. No names. No stones. Just wildflowers that bloom out of season, and a strange warmth that lingers in the soil. Some say if you kneel there and close your eyes, not to ask questions, but to simply listen, you will hear the truth. Not in words, but in forgiveness. A forgiveness deeper than vengeance. A love greater than justice. And in that moment, you'll understand why the town is afraid. Because the sisters were never the danger. It was what we did to them that cursed the land. The truth doesn't always come with answers. Sometimes it comes with weight. A weight so old, so carefully buried beneath tradition and silence, that when you finally lift it, you feel the bones underneath. The story of the Sisters Belladoux was never meant to reach you. That was the point. Blackvale was never just a town. It was a mechanism, a theater of obedience. It was not a place of hospitality. It was a system, a spiritual siphon dressed in velvet and lace. And the sisters? They were the blood it fed on. Here's what few are willing to admit. The guests of Briarfield were not random. They were selected. Each man who entered that place was part of something far more intricate. Clergy, politicians, bankers, doctors. Every room was designed for rituals that rewired belief, restructured loyalty, broke the self. What happened in that parlor, behind those lace curtains, was not merely seduction or sacrifice. It was programming. The sisters were forced into scripts written by forces above the law, forces that needed obedient men molded in silence. And the sisters? They weren't witches. They were mirrors. They reflected back what these men truly were: broken, hungry, consumed by power. And that's why they were buried. That's why their names were wiped from ledgers, why their portraits vanished, why every effort was made to drown the truth in superstition. Because these women knew too much. And those who know too much are not allowed to live or be remembered. So Blackvale created its legend. Turned the sisters into something unholy. Blamed them for the very systems they were devoured by. The people never questioned it. Because it's easier to believe in curses than to admit complicity. Easier to burn witches than to confront priests in masks. But you've heard the story now. And whether you believe it or not, the land remembers. The wind through Blackvale's woods does not whisper myths. It whispers names. And sometimes, if you stand outside the Briarfield gates under a blood moon, you'll hear laughter, not cruel, not cursed, just free. And that is the sound they tried so hard to silence. What remains now are questions, deep, unhealed, and echoing. Why do so many powerful institutions fear forgotten women? Why do the official records go silent at the moment the whispers grow loud? Why are we taught to mock the mystical, when it is often the mystical that hides the truth? The Sisters Belladoux did not die in shame. They died with secrets, and it is those secrets that still frighten the architects of your modern world. There is a reason these stories vanish from textbooks and archives. Not because they are fiction, but because they are dangerous truths wrapped in ritual and blood. Briarfield Inn has become a metaphor, a symbol for how beauty, obedience, and silence were weaponized. But it was always more than metaphor. It was machinery, and machinery never stops. It simply changes its shape. So look around you. The modern inns may have better lighting, softer walls, and newer language. But the blueprint remains the same. Groom the vulnerable. Sacrifice the inconvenient. Blame the damned. You've followed this story from its hollow bones to its haunted breath. You've walked the shadowed corridors, listened at the hidden doors, and stared at the mirror with its frame of thorns. Now it's your turn to speak. Drop a comment below and say the phrase, "The wind does not lie." Let them know you heard the truth they tried to erase. And if you dare, share this video. Send it to someone who still thinks history is written by scholars and not by blood. Subscribe to DeadScroll because this is not the end. It's only the next door. And behind it, the story they swore you'd never survive hearing. See you in the next one.